You are officially invited. Yes, you. You're invited to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. This is my 10-week group coaching program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your cycles for conception, we have a spot for you. We start the last week of February. Are you ready to jump in? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 402. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health, because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today, I'm sharing a brand new episode in my Fertility Awareness reality series. I'm sharing a call with my client, Shalom, who is a member of my previous Fertility Awareness Mastery Live group program. And in today's call, she's sharing some of the challenges that she's experienced along the way of her fertility journey. So her fertility journey to her first child, and also currently her fertility journey to her second child, which she's in the middle of. And we talk about a couple of interesting things. I think one of the themes that comes up in today's call is that idea of forming a team around you when you are dealing with a specific health challenge and getting that support from more than one area. One of the challenges that Shalom shares is the expense of having multiple testing done. And so, in her experience, she spent a lot of money with certain practitioners doing a wide variety of tests, only to have a separate practitioner look at her overall picture and basically get right to the point. And that's when she kind of gets into her Hashimoto's diagnosis. And so from my perspective, the takeaway on my end, and of course, coming from the perspective of utilizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, is that it can be extremely helpful in your fertility journey to have the option to look at your cycle and the connection between your cycle and your overall health as an additional marker to track your success, because it gives you a different picture, a different window into your cycle, into the overall situation. And especially with conception, one of the things that I found with my conception clients is that when you have a client who's charting their cycles, and you can see when they're having their acts of intimacy, and especially when you're working with somebody, or if you've personally been in this experience where you have been trying to conceive for a long period of time, and you know enough about your cycle to know how to time sex correctly, and it's still not happening. I think for me, that's why I talk so much about male fertility and its role in conception and fertility in general, because that's a fact that is in your face when you're looking at the chart. When you're actually having sex at the correct time over and over again for a long time and conception isn't happening, we really do have to look deeper. And we can't, there's often issues, of course, on the female side, but we can't assume ever that everything's okay on the male side. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode with Shalom. And I'm really excited to welcome Shalom to the show. Shalom is in my Fertility Awareness Mastery Live group coaching program, and we're recording this kind of midway in the program. And so we've had several weeks together, a couple hot seats. So I feel like we've got our feet wet. We've kind of know where we're at. We have lots to talk about today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And I think, well, I always like to start by asking you to share just a little bit about your menstrual history. I mean, where else can you do that? So maybe you could share with us, when you had your first period and, what that was like. And if you've used hormonal contraceptives before, and basically what brought you to this point now where you were jumping into fertility awareness.
I started my period really young. I am young for my grade. So if I wasn't, I would have started my period in elementary school. I remember I'm the youngest of four. I have two older sisters, and I remember not telling anybody and just ignoring it until one day my sister confronted me in front of my mom. So I'm really good at ignoring my body. But I've always, at least as long as I can remember, I feel like I've had pretty painful periods. I have a history in my family of endometriosis. And anyways, I can't remember when I got on birth control, but I know I did when I got married in my 20s, early 20s, was probably on it. I feel like I was on it for like at least 8 years. I could be wrong, but a long time. And periods were probably better during that time. But we decided to try to start having kids. At first, it was like, okay, I'll just stop taking birth control. And nothing happened. Tried to get more focused on the efforts. Nothing happened. Had my OBGYN note that I had some thyroid cyst formation. So I went and got that checked out, and nothing really came of it. I had like 2 thyroid blood tests done, and everything was within normal limits. So they didn't do anything. Specialists didn't do anything. Find out later that I have Hashimoto's. That happened. And then I got pregnant probably 6 months after that and had a super complicated pregnancy. My little guy had IUGR, and so we were monitored pretty hardcore for about 2 months. Ultrasounds literally 2 to 3 times a week, NSTs 2 times a week. They almost decided to do an in utero blood transfusion, and his parameters just changed, so we just barely missed that. But anyways, he ended up coming 6 weeks early at 2 pounds 5 ounces through an emergency C-section and 7 weeks in the NICU. So that was very exciting times. Fast forward trying to get pregnant now, not succeeding I got pregnant on Clomid, the highest dose, and tried Clomid for a year. Wish I didn't do that. It was not fun and didn't succeed in getting pregnant. So we went to a fertility specialist, went through 1 round of IUI. After having $4,000 of fertility tests done, with the fertility specialist actually saying, oh yeah, everything looks fine. Your thyroid's just a little off, but whatever. Went through a failed cycle of an IUI and just kind of felt really awful afterwards. So I thought I'm going to take some time and just really maximize my health to maximize any outcomes in the future, and started listening to your podcast. And super fun and interesting. This is just a plug for your podcast in terms of like, read about this doctor and, oh man, what do they have to say about infertility, this or that? And you'd interview them. So I'd be like, oh, okay. And I just keep coming back to your podcast because of that. So thank you for being such a great resource for me. Lost my train of thought just a little bit. So I actually ended up going to a naturopath who took all of the $4,000 of tests and all of my past tests and said, oh, actually, you have Hashimoto's. Oh, actually, you have elevated of this protein, and so you're more likely to have blood clots. So it's probably why your placenta was the size of a pancake and why your son was so small. And anyways, so I've just been down a journey of health lately and learning a lot about my body and learning how much I've ignored it in the past. And here we are.
Well, thank you for taking us through that. I'm always just fascinated, because I think also in our sessions, we talk about a lot. I feel like we make good use of our time, but it's really only in the podcast interview forum that I can just ask the question and for you to just share your journey in that kind of a way. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I always really like, because this gives us an opportunity. We've talked a lot, but this gives us an opportunity, or at least me, an opportunity to hear your story in a different way, maybe in a more organic way. You've obviously struggled with a lot of challenges, and I feel like a lot of the listeners can relate to what you're saying, because yeah, the lab tests aren't cheap. And I mean, every practitioner has their own style and their own way of dealing with things. So, and it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. And this is why I share the approach, my analogy, the boardroom analogy of, I picture you sitting at the head of the table at the boardroom. And really, we especially when you're dealing with a challenge like fertility issues, you really do need to have, in my opinion, a team. So you really do need to have your MD, your family doctor. You need to have your fertility specialist. Yep, I think you need to have your naturopath and etc. But like everyone does things in a bit of a different way. So in the approach that I take, lab testing is obviously warranted in certain cases, but it's not my first go-to, which is interesting when you're looking at the cycle and symptoms, obviously, as well. Those two things really warrant then what kinds of testing that would make sense. So I thought what you said was so interesting. And I just can't even imagine how you felt about that, which was, I did all these tests and then I went to one practitioner who was like, oh, you have Hashimoto's. I mean, it's just, but this is all obviously why we need to have a team. And there was something else I wanted to ask you about. I mean, maybe this is just curious or interest, but when you were talking about how you had your first period really young, so I can remember my first friend to have her period. So she was actually older than me. I don't remember at the time. It seems like such a big deal when you're 8, right? That your friend is like 9 or 9.5 or 10 or whatever. But I was in grade 4. So she was also in grade 4. And she got her, she had her period. And the only reason I knew was because there was this one day that she said something about like, oh, I got to get a pad or whatever. And I was like, what? Like a pad of paper? Like I'm like 8 or 9, right? And she's like, no, like for your period. And I was like, oh, because that was the first time, right, that I had ever even had that conversation with a friend.
Right.
Now I would be so curious if she's listening, she knows who, because she must, I don't know if she's listening, because who else was I in like grade 4 with or whatever, who had their period. But I would be so, because I she's a friend that I don't talk to a lot anymore, we lost touch. But anyways, I would be so curious to hear what her experience is like. So I've spoken to different women, and for some women, when they get their period so early, it's traumatic. I've spoken to women who got their period at 10 and they are still traumatized. They were not prepared. They thought they were dying. No one adequately explained anything to them. And so yeah, anyways, this is a long way of asking the question, which was, you mentioned that you hit it. And I'm curious what that looked like and what you think about that looking back.
So having 2 older sisters ahead of me, I literally just, all right, I started wearing pads and, I think that's how my sister scouted me out. Like they're missing now, or I don't know. I don't know why I did that. I don't know.
Was it just like was it like a normal thing, or were you embarrassed about it, or were you just kind of like, this is just what we do?
No, I was embarrassed about it.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. And I was kind of like a pretty shy, timid kid. And I think that might have had something to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And you'd mentioned something else, and I feel like it came up a couple of times, but you kind of said that I was kind of really good at ignoring my body or something along those lines. And so this process of going through the charting and being so super involved must be really interesting. I'm just curious if you wanted to comment on that a little bit more.
Yes. So what's interesting to me in terms of the first cycle, I found what I was looking for because I wasn't listening to my body, if that makes sense. Like, oh, okay, this is when I'm ovulating, and then everything else looks normal. But it wasn't. I was kind of ignoring those like abnormal mucus patterns, or like, oh, that's kind of weird, but it only happens once or twice a day. So the rest of it's normal. So I'll just pretend like everything else is normal. So through the cycle charting, I've learned how much I don't actually observe and how much I just kind of push through and say, nope, this is what I want to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, we can transition into the session part of today's call. You sent me your recent charts, and yeah, I'm excited to dig into it. So before we jump in, let me know what is kind of at the top of your mind, what you want to make sure that we talk about today.
So, any of your thoughts concerning the mucus pattern? I'm happy to hear about that, considering how different this is from my first cycle chart.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the questions I had, because we were going back and forth on Slack. So Slack is how we communicate in between sessions for the listeners who might not know. It's been great. I used to use Facebook, and I find Slack is just the greatest thing ever. That's just this episode is not sponsored by Slack. Maybe it should be. This is not. Anyways, I'll stop. But anyways, we've been going back and forth about a couple of things in the class. And I think one of the questions I had, particularly before I saw, this is the first time I'm seeing your second chart here, but my first question whenever I hear about mucus stuff is like, I want to know what's actually happening so that we can identify, like, is it really mucus? Is it that wet observation that we see from cervical issues sometimes? Or, that's from the kind of practitioner lens. That's the first thing for me to really figure out, like, what is it that we're seeing? So in this first chart here, this is your September to October chart. You marked a few days of mucus, and then you marked quite a bit of dry days with shiny and a little bit of dampness. Whereas in the second chart that we're looking at here, you marked many more days of mucus. So now I'm actually seeing more of what you were talking about, because you were concerned about having mucus all the time. But in this previous chart, it kind of looked different.
Right. That was me ignoring it. Like, oh, that's once. Oh, I don't know. Okay. The rest of it's dry. The rest of it's doing what it's supposed to. But just it's just once or twice a day. So it just.
Interesting. Yeah, because I feel like we talked about this at some point, and I was like, no, write it down.
Yeah. No, it's just stupidity as well.
So let's talk, because I think when I saw this chart, I was curious as to whether or not what you were seeing was just dampness with no lubrication. So like you wipe and the toilet paper is damp, and that's what you're seeing.
Definitely something I can take off. You said something in one of our group sessions that said, no, if you can take it off the toilet paper, that is mucus. And for whatever reason, the way you said it, absolutely clicked in my mind. And I'm like, oh, ignoring this.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's helpful. So this is what I always say is the first chart that we have together is a learning chart. And so it gives us an opportunity to establish a baseline, but also gives an opportunity for me to really, because basically what I'm teaching everyone in the class, at least the mucus part, is a mucus language. We've got notations and all the stuff that we learn together. And what it is essentially a standardized way of identifying what we're seeing so that what you write down means something, and it means the same thing to me. And it allows me to figure this all out. So that's the little background. So then here to check in with you. So towards the beginning of the cycle, let me see here. Okay, so this is where you're writing the sensation. On this day, you're seeing mucus that is cloudy and yellow, that's stretchy, twice. And you had like a dry / smooth sensation.
Yeah, I think when I do dry / smooth, I think I'm trying to say it's dry most of the day, but maybe I had that smooth twice.
Okay. Well, so for simplicity's sake, at the end of the day, quote, you're noting the quote most fertile sign, even though we've talked extensively about how all preovulatory mucus is considered to be fertile. Right. I can't help myself. It's just like, yeah. So if you have several dry observations and like one smooth, you could just write the smooth and then how many times you saw it.
Okay.
So up to you. And so then you had one day, this day, so cycle day 9, where it was dry, and then you noted a little bit of dampness.
Right.
And so, see, it looks like ovulation happened cycle day 17. Not sure if you had made a decision on that. I'm just marking up the chart. So yeah, looks like it. That's where I would put it. So let's see what was happening with your mucus. Actually, that makes sense. So we have cloudy mucus leading up, and then you start seeing some clear mucus on this day, cycle day 11. I'm going to get into some nitty gritty stuff that may not mean anything to the listeners. But on these days that you're marking a lubricative sensation, you can put the dark purple.
Okay, anytime it's lubricative.
Peak mucus, the definition would be clear or stretchy or lubricative.
Or.
So it's the or that, it trips up everybody.
Yeah.
Let's see. But then when you go into your window, you've got some good mucus observations here, and you're seeing your clear stretchy 4 or more times on these days. I think I always mix encouragement with acknowledging of the issues. So obviously, like the mucus pattern here lasts for, what's 21 minus 6? The mucus pattern lasts for 15 days. So obviously that's more than what we want.
Right.
I suppose the good news is that you do have good mucus leading up to ovulation. So, but what it looks like is, it looks like you're showing what looks to be somewhat of a basic infertile pattern that is mucus. So this is good data and information that you got. So I'm glad that you kind of sorted that out from the first cycle to the next. And from now that you can kind of, from my perspective, because I just see the chart, like I'm not in your panties, spoiler alert. So when you were mentioning that you had a lot of mucus, I was kind of like, well, it looks okay. And so I was actually looking forward to getting in there and finding out what you're actually seeing. So then so let's see. So you had these 2 days of mucus more than like all day. And then, so your peak day, it's kind of a little off. The peak day would be day 18. That's the last day with peak qualities.
Okay.
So it's lubricative and stretchy, which appears to be like on the 3rd day of your high temperature. Let me see. Did you notice a shift in your mucus from when you had it on these days? Like, did you notice a difference in terms of the so here, when you get into these days where you're seeing cloudy yellow, that's obviously quite different. But did you notice a bit of a shift in your mucus pattern?
Yes. So I do feel like I am able to be like, oh, this is my fertile mucus versus, this is just the stuff that's happening all the time. The quantity is much more. I feel like I do produce a fair amount of mucus compared to others listening in on our group calls and things like that. I'm not searching for it. It's there. And so, it's a lot. The quantity is greater. It's super clear and stretchy and consistently that way.
Mm-hmm. And the mucus that's tinted yellow, is that something that you've noticed? Is that something that's been pretty consistent?
It feels consistent. Yeah. It's random, but it's not. I feel like I have seen that for months.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is, so we had a conversation or a few, and they were centered around the issue with thyroid, and we went through some of those things together. We talked a little bit about antibodies and the effect that can have on conception. And it definitely felt like it was one of the biggest concerns, obviously, that you had. And recently you've had an interesting discovery about histamines. So maybe share a little bit about that. So I'm not sure. We'll have to see.
Right.
I have a hunch that it's likely related. When we see patterns like this with all the mucus all the time, what I have found is that it can be related to a few things. I've seen it correlated with issues of gut health, with inflammation, like chronic inflammation that's associated with different, IBS type issues. When it's more gut related, I tend to also see a bit of spotting occasionally and things like that. So there's kind of like a characteristic way that gut issues and inflammation, and when you have a serious reaction when you consume certain things, like that kind of appears in a certain way. But also in general, allergies, it's kind of like that concept of like a runny nose, like a runny cervix, where you have all of this mucus that you're making throughout the cycle, but it's not necessarily this. I mean, you're not fertile for 15 days. So the majority of those days that you're seeing, and we can see the difference in it. So during your fertile window, we're seeing actual clear, stretchy mucus. That makes a lot of sense for where you are in the cycle. And outside of that, we are seeing more of the cloudy and with the yellow tinge and things like that, is it just regular? Is it ever kind of gummy, or is it just normal?
So this is where I get confused as well. It starts out Like I can be like, whoa, that's really stretchy. And then after I do it like 5 times, it starts to get more of that gummy.
So it kind of snaps back a little bit. And then when you're in the window seeing the clear, stretchy, it's not doing that?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what you've discovered with histamine. I guess I was going on a little bit of a tangent, but when you're having those types of reactions, that's on that. It's like a hyper allergic reaction to a lot of things, essentially. And that can be then related. And so it is possible that by getting that under control in a variety of things that you're doing, it is possible that that could shift the mucus, but we'll have to kind of see if that's really what the issue is. But share with us a little bit about what's been happening there.
So kind of the history, kind of start with the history of, or I would call them my body freakouts. They started after I broke my femur and dislocated my kneecap, did some rehabilitation for that, but not necessarily very much cardio. So I went from like being pretty much doing nothing to running 400s with the varsity basketball team and just pretty much dying, wheezing, turned to on the ground in the fetal position, vomiting, stomach cramping, felt like my uterus cramping too. I've had times where I actually spot blood after these episodes. And then sometimes afterwards, after these episodes as well, especially the first, this happened once a week for like a month or something like that, having to run these 400s. And maybe it was 2 times a week, I'm not sure, but I would go home after these awful experiences and then my nose would run so intensely, my eyes would just be watering. I couldn't have any airflow through my nose or I would sneeze. So I'd literally have to block my nasal passages. So it wouldn't send me into this hyper allergic like response. So I was like pretty incapacitated by these events. And so I kind of worked through them in a way. I got put down on a lower level on the basketball team, so I wasn't getting challenged as intensely. But these episodes kind of kept happening through high school, through college. My last one was probably 8 years ago. No, that's probably like 5 or 6 years ago. But yeah, it's interesting. I've had hives as well through high school that happen when I'm they seem to be encouraged when I'm hot or stressed, but that's not always the case. So it was always very confusing trying to figure out the hive aspect. So yeah, just recently doing more research on this topic in terms of finding more answers through mast cell activation syndrome and just kind of histamine intolerance in general. I really feel like those are describing all of the weird things that have been happening in my body since I was 13. So I'm kind of exploring that path and seeing where it's going to take me.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's this is why for me the chart is kind of essential, and why I like to give enough time to get the full chart, the first full cycle, but also to really see what's happening. So there's a couple things I think to keep in mind. So the first we've talked about extensively, I think, which is that when you're trying to conceive, the cycle does not need to be perfect in order for that to happen. So I think that's important. And it's very interesting because in many of our conversations, it was really, and this is also something to think about for all the listeners, you were really focused on the thyroid antibodies, but at the end of the day, you really dove into that with your practitioner and you're really doing a lot of the things that you would need to be doing for that. So it's kind of like we've identified it, we're addressing it. We kind of need to let those strategies work now. Right. And then what's interesting is, how, because in the messages that you sent me, it's like, wow. And histamine issues are very characteristic and also very just uncomfortable. And it's just not a pleasant thing to have to deal with these histamine issues. And so it's really interesting that somehow that kind of fell into the background. But I would imagine that it's because you've been dealing with it for so long that it's just kind of like, this is just how it is. This is just how I am. We don't really think about how it could be affecting it until you start charting. And then you see the mucus all the time. And you're kind of like, what is happening? Why am I seeing this all the time?
Right. And when I'd get my hives and things like that before, I just pop an antihistamine and forget about it. And now I'm really trying not to take any medication. And so they're a lot more annoying. And so I'm having to not ignore them.
It's time, ladies. Time to take your fertility awareness knowledge and confidence to the next level. Just popping into today's episode to invite you to join us for the next round of Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. My 10-week group coaching program is designed to help you unlock the secrets of your menstrual cycle. Fertility Awareness Mastery teaches you everything you need to know about using fertility awareness cycle tracking to achieve your intentions. Whether you're currently trying to get pregnant, avoiding pregnancy, or planning to conceive in the future, we've got you covered. This program goes deep. Get to the root of your period problems, hormone imbalances, fertility challenges, and so much more. Early bird registration is now open, but only for a limited time. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'm not, anti-medication, just to put it out there. Like a good example of that is period pain. I think that obviously there's a lot of things we can do to reduce inflammation and really try to work on addressing it, because you want to get to the point where you're not having to take all of this Advil, for example. But when you have the pain, until you've sorted that out, I'm not anti-Advil, but I see what you're saying, because if you're having to try to address it and also understanding more about it and how it works, then it makes sense. And so, in terms of addressing it, yeah, maybe share a little bit about some of the things that you're doing to address it. I know you had mentioned that there's certain foods that you were eating that were high histamine foods. It's like, and it's hard because it's like the healthiest stuff. It's like fermented foods. It's like bone broth. It's like all these things that are really healthy and great for you. But if you have an out of control histamine problem, the first step is to not necessarily forever, but certainly temporarily for a period of time to get rid of them. And it sounds like you had some astounding improvements.
Right. So yeah, I've been eating, I want to say really well, especially compared to what I was eating, 8 months ago. So I have been eating those bone broths, fermented vegetables. To go with the sauerkraut, I've been eating more grass-fed, nitrate-free organic sausages. And I caught a cold. And so I was like, I'm going to down a bunch of lemon water. And it was amazing. Every night I'd go to sleep and I'd wake up in the middle of the night with hives. And so that happened for 7 days in a row. And then I kind of stumbled across this histamine things through your podcast, turned into somebody else's podcast, and just kind of went down, a little rabbit hole there. And so found this information about kind of histamine intolerance and those kinds of things. So I went to a low histamine diet. And so the first night I would say that my hives were a 8 out of 10. And then I went to a 2 out of 10 as soon as I changed my diet. And then I haven't gotten hives since, except for a little bit in the shower one night. My feet got really hot. That happens on occasion too. So that's the beginning of it. But I'm honestly at a standstill. I kind of don't know what to do with my food because it is so limiting. I'm already dairy-free, gluten-free, trying to avoid nightshades, do all of these things, and then trying to change that as well to do low histamine. While taking out all of those healthy things that I know that are improving my egg quality and gut health and all of those things. So I do feel a little stuck at the moment. So I'm looking to gather as much information as I can so I unstuck myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough situation to be in, because I know a lot of the dietary restrictions you had imposed. It's obviously these are all for very valid reasons. These were things to lower antibodies and to address the thyroid issues and things like that. And this is one of the challenges inherent in these issues, because we're perpetually balancing these health issues that we're trying to address, plus the preconception, nutrition, and care. And so I think that's where these conversations come in. And it might be, I think that it's a good opportunity to have a conversation with your naturopath and have some additional support to re-strategize, because I know a lot of the things that you were doing were part of a protocol. And I would imagine that this would change things with your naturopath as well. You're taking a lot of supplements. The last thing you need is like a whole bunch more. It would be a good idea to have this conversation, like taking all these things. I've cut out like everything I love to eat. And now I have 2 issues that I'm juggling.
Right.
And it's obviously not going to work for me to be doing both of these diets.
Right.
There comes a point where
I have an appointment on Thursday. So
yeah, I'm not surprised. I know you're on top of it, but yeah, it's something where from my standpoint, I think that, so even just in general, this is how I look at things. And this has been my experience when you're looking at things with the menstrual cycle, but there's the 80-20 rule. And it's like, out of everything you're doing, 20% of it yields 80% of the results. So for example, when you have an issue with the cycle, like mucus all the time, often there's legitimately like one issue. And when you knock out that issue, it solves 80% of the problem. And then the rest of it, we can tweak with a variety of other things. And so I think the first and foremost, there's no perfect. We goodbye perfect. We have to take perfect, put it in a box and throw it out the window, right? Like there's no perfect. And also you're not a case study, you're a person, you're Shalom. And so I say that because at the end of the day, like you have to eat something.
Right. I do.
And when you get, when you conceive, you still have to eat things.
Right.
I think that it might be time to reevaluate the strategy regarding the antibodies because it's obviously an issue. It may actually not be the biggest issue. We don't know. It could be. But this issue is causing you to wake up every night with hives. So I feel like this should at least temporarily take precedence, not forgetting the other issue. I feel like I said, you're doing a lot of things. We could list the specific supplements that you're taking. We could list the specific food changes that you've made. But I would say have a conversation about like, what are the most important things for me to deal with this antibody issue? Like let's try to reduce inflammation. We know gluten doesn't help with the antibodies, but maybe given the limitations that I'm facing with the histamine issue, which is a lot more pressing, I can't actually get rid of all of these things right now. And then there are tests for these things. So you schedule a test after however long with the new protocol, and you should then be able to see whether right. So these are things where if you make an adjustment, it's not to say that if you made the wrong choice, it's the end of the world. You can still identify what's happening. And just another point, this isn't really relevant for you and our conversation right now, but I think for the listeners, because of course you've been trying to conceive for a while now. One of the things that we're not talking about a lot today, because we've spent a little bit of time in our previous sessions and things, we've talked a little bit about sperm quality and all that kind of stuff. And so just for the listeners, that was one of the first things that I attacked regarding this. But what do you think about it? We talked a little bit about, and one of the things you said, I like to eat. I don't really have hangups around food. So this is really not ideal. I would like to incorporate a few more things. Like, what are your thoughts?
I feel very stuck on the subject. Last night, I am actually pretty restrictive in my diet. I've been trying to avoid corn, legumes, peanuts, nuts. Some of this is thyroid protocol. Some of this is food allergy tests that I received. So eggs, legumes, I'm sure there were a few other things I'm spacing out on, but those came back really high. And so...
And you know that food allergy tests tend to come back high on the things you eat the most.
So, yeah. So I'd like to honestly kind of get a rehashing out of that. But anyways, I had some corn last night and that really seemed to upset my stomach, my GI. And so I have tested the water somewhat on some of them. And then I get concerned of my stomach hurt a little bit more. Is this causing issues and inflammation in my body? So yeah. I look forward to getting unstuck on this topic so I can hopefully eat more soon and just less restricted,
Yeah. It's definitely a tough spot. So, I mean, from the conception standpoint, I think it's like trying to focus on all the things you can eat might be helpful. It might be a good exercise for you to pull out a piece of paper and write down in categories all the things you can eat. So the category of meat, the category of veg, the category of fruits, the category of nuts and seeds, if there's anything left. But to actually write out what you can and cannot consume, or not cannot, like all the things that you can
Yeah, focus on the positive.
Well, but also from a practical standpoint, because if you've cut out a bunch of stuff, then it also is you have to make dinner. Like, so from a practical standpoint, it can be helpful to actually have this list of all the things that you could consume. So for example, if you're down to like meat and veg and not even all veg, it might be helpful to actually write out a list of some of those meats and some of the vegetables that you can actually consume, like all of them, so that when you go to think about making dinner, within that list, there's probably some things that you really like. And it might even be an opportunity. I'm obviously trying to look at this in a positive way, but it might be an opportunity for you to try new things. If there's like a farmer's market by you, there might be all these, like, I don't know if squash is on the list. Is it, or is it off the list?
I can eat. Yeah, I eat squash.
Okay. So for example, we go to there's a couple of farm stores, and there's like 7 different kinds, like maybe even like 10 different kinds of squash, right? Squash is squash. It's not like it's that exciting, but you know what I'm trying to say here. So like as a temporary measure, trying to kind of do that and incorporate as much of what you can into it. Like, can you do shellfish? Do you like shellfish? Can you do fish? Can you do?
From what I'm reading, fish, unless it is frozen immediately and then unfrozen, it tends to be a higher histamine food. Right. So,
well, and what this could look like is, I usually do things by cycles. So, I'm prone to say like do one full cycle, but I mean, I think it would make a lot of sense to do one full cycle or the equivalent where you go pretty hard on this because your body needs a chance to rest. I think. Yeah, because it's been triggered so much. So like 1 or 2 full cycles. With that said, I think that the foods that are not histamine triggering foods, that's the conversation to have with your naturopath about incorporating some of these things so that we're dealing with the most pressing matter and that you're not, because I think it probably goes without saying, but when you are in a situation where you are severely restricting what you're consuming, there are plenty of occasions where it makes sense for a period of time, but if it goes on for 6 months to a year, then you can end up inadvertently, it's just not necessarily the best thing in the world. Right.
Missing nutrients and
It's certainly possible depending on the situation, all those kinds of things. So I think it's about having a strategy and a plan and then a way to start incorporating foods later on down the line so that it doesn't become and I never eat nightshades again. It becomes and I'm removing them for a period of time for a reason. And there's a strategy that I'm developing to reincorporate those foods when appropriate so that I can really identify what really is bad for me. So you try to incorporate corn and it causes a reaction when you have more information. It doesn't mean you never eat corn again, but it could mean that maybe you go a little bit longer and you work on some gut healing and things like that. And then I think what might help you to get unstuck is that appointment that you have on Thursday, but go into it, like spend some time thinking about it. Like I said, write out the list and think logically for yourself, like what would it actually make sense for me to put back in? So go in with an idea from yourself of like, okay, these are all the things I've cut out and right. And this is why, and et cetera. And now with the histamine issue, it's different, like certain foods that you would be able to eat with the low histamine diet. And then once you have that, we can certainly have a conversation as well and see if I can support you to feel good about whatever strategy that you think it's best.
That's good.
It's a lot going on, Shalom.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
And it's funny through this process, I'm one to, again, kind of be like, oh no, everything's fine. It's okay. And so to not ignore that and be like, all right, this is a problem. This is a problem.
Yeah.
It's a different thing for me.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the charting can be a double-edged sword depending on your personality. Obviously, the way that I'm teaching you to chart is very specific. So there's a lot of minute details. And so the positive about that is that we get a good idea of what's happening and you can see whether or not it's falling into normal parameters. That's a positive. And obviously in a case like this, my hunch is that it's certainly related to the histamines. It's quite likely, given that when you have a lot of histamines, you always have a runny nose. Like the body is a very interesting thing.
Right.
In
It's a
some ways, it's
mucus
very
pattern
complicated, but
differently.
yeah, just like when you take antihistamines, it causes your mucus to dry up. Like it just is what it is. It's like a thing. So my hunch is that it's related, and then this gives us a way to actually see that okay, that's what is happening here.
Yeah.
And so we'll just have to see with your next cycle. And I did have a question. Do you remember when you came to this realization? Like, wasn't it this weekend? Like,
It
when
was
did you?
this weekend. Yeah. It was, and I was telling you this a little earlier in terms of with the Hashimoto's diagnosis, I was kind of like, oh yeah, it kind of vaguely describes what I'm going through. But when I came across this information, I actually and connected all the dots of all the things that have happened since I was 13 years old. I like sobbed to my husband about it. And so it does kind of feel like I don't know, it feels like this has kind of been what's going on in my health for so long.
Because it's when you're having these issues and you just don't even know. It's so powerful to have someone put a name to it. And also, it's not in your head. This makes it real. It's a real thing. We can research it. We can learn about it. There's strategies as opposed to just, I just feel like crap all the time and I don't know why. So that's huge. Well, I don't know if this is super meaningful, but I'll just point this out in case you didn't notice. So we have your period, and then we basically have about 15 days of mucus with one dry day in the middle. And this is including after ovulation as well. And then there was one day where, but yeah, so a lot of days. But interestingly, on the weekend, it kind of shifted and you didn't see. I mean,
Right.
you're still seeing some, but there was a shift. I don't know if that's really, it's always too soon to tell. I think that
Right.
we'll have a better idea in your next cycle. We'll, track that and see what's going on. But like I said, my hunch is, and now for me, it all makes sense as well. Cause you were saying I have so much mucus all the time. And so now to see the filled in chart with everything that you're seeing, it all makes sense. And so I guess the good part of all of this is that we do have the diet action plan. I think we still have to work on. So we'll touch base about that again once you've had your appointment. But I think the good news is that we actually have an action plan. Even though you're cutting out a lot of foods, there's still room for some of the most nutrient dense foods,
Right.
like liver. I won't shut up about the liver. But anyway, so we can still work within that, right? For the preconception care and things like that. But we do have an action plan for the things that are happening with you. And then we also have an action plan for your partner to like improve the sperm quality. Cause I should put it on a t-shirt, but I don't think there's any man alive who is so healthy that he can't benefit from at least a multivitamin or some liver. So that's the good news. And now we're at the part where just keep charting, keep tracking, and we'll see how these changes, we'll see what your cycle's like the next time. And that's really going to tell us if we're getting close to identifying what's causing all this mucus.
Right.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
Before we go, I just want to ask you a question, for the listeners who are thinking about jumping into the fertility awareness mastery, the coaching program, maybe share with them what your thoughts are, based on what your experience has been so far.
I feel like the information you have given me is something that women should be brought up with. It's really amazing to hear some of this stuff and be like, man, I have a doctorate of physical therapy. I went through so many anatomy classes. How did I just learn that about my body? So I am grateful, and I feel like this is information that we should be giving our daughters, giving each other. Great. I really enjoy talking with my friends about it. And I've been a part of the group sessions. And so it's really nice connecting with other women and hearing their struggles and getting the information that you give almost repeated into my brain. And so I actually connect with it more often. And yeah, this is just, in my mind, just necessary information as a female.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely feel like over the years, I feel like my client work is what always connects me to how important it is. Because as you can imagine, I mean, it can potentially wear off. Like if you were just to kind of, once you finish the class, just to go about charting your cycles and improve your overall cycles, conceive, have a baby, chart, live your life. In 10 years, it's not as new and fresh in your mind. It's kind of something that falls into the background that you take for granted that you just do all the time. And so honestly, for me, it's really my client work that continues to just highlight how important it is, because every woman should be able to let this fall into the background and take for granted. Like that's the world I would like to be in. Because it's just something that we all do, and it's something that we all know, and like that would be actually the way I would like to live.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll get there.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/402. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Shalom. I do feel like it was a great conversation and just a great reminder at the importance of setting up your team and to always have more than one opinion and perspective. So especially coming from somebody who is working from a perspective that isn't as common, most practitioners aren't looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and looking at it as kind of a central piece or way to evaluate overall health. And so there's a significant benefit to not to get 1,000 opinions and go to 1 million people, but there's a significant benefit to seeking at least more than one perspective. So if you have your medical doctor, your fertility specialist, it is helpful to seek also the opinion of a functional practitioner or somebody who can look at the menstrual cycle, especially if you're dealing with fertility and you have some concerns about that. It is helpful to check into those things and see how everything's going. But the value of having more than one perspective, so that I think one of the great analogies that has come up on the podcast a number of times is that kind of what's in your tool belt analogy. So if you're going to a surgeon, the surgeon has surgery in their tool belt. If you're going to a medical doctor, typically they have drugs, often surgeries or other procedures in their tool belt. If you're going to a nutritionist, then obviously nutrition is what's in their tool belt. And functional practitioners are often looking at those underlying factors that are contributing to hormonal imbalances and really looking at trying to identify the root cause of issues. So having a team of practitioners, especially if you're dealing with serious challenges or ongoing fertility challenges, can be extremely helpful. It's not to say that one person is necessarily right over the other, but to have that complete picture can be extremely beneficial. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.